Oh, welcome back, everybody. I know it's been a while, but so now we're going to start into the facts portion of core facts. Um, and the core was all about proving, God's existence. The facts portion is FAC and T are about the uh, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So being able to see the resurrection, not just in the Bible, because we know that we see it in the Bible, but also in history and things like that, and how this is kind of the next step, right? I told you apologetics, I look at it as a two-step process. Step one is God exists. Step two is God raised Jesus from the dead. So um, we're going to start looking at the F for facts, which is the fact of the resurrection of Jesus. So he says, surprisingly, when skeptics seek to discredit the central miracle of the New Testament, they seldom begin in the most obvious place. Right? They'd rather talk about Jesus healing a blind man or walking on water or water into wine than the fact that a guy rose from the dead. So it's kind of weird that they would that wouldn't be where you'd start. I think that should be where you start if you're going to go against it. And if you ever watched the movie Case for Christ, it's about Lee Strobel. He says, where would one start to disprove the Bible? And the guy he's talking to says, well, it's easy. You start at the center of it, and that's the resurrection. So that's what Lee Strobel was seeking to discredit the resurrection, and he ended up writing one of the great apologetic books, which is The Case for Christ, which is about the proof of the resurrection. So, but he says, rather than scrutinizing his appearances or the testimony of the early church, they often begin by questioning whether Jesus actually died when he was crucified. Right? This is where people will start: is did Jesus really die? Right? So the argument works like this: Jesus had to die in order to rise from the dead. He never really died, therefore there was no resurrection. Now that sounds silly to us because we know that Jesus died. And in the notes portion of the lesson this week, I'll put a journal article in there. It's a medical journal article which talks about the medical proof for Jesus' death on the cross. And it's done by the Journal of American Medical Society. So it's like bigwig article, all about the death of Jesus. So this idea is known as the swoon theory. But we have to look at the fact that after all that he endured leading up to it, right? He was flogged, he was beaten, punched a few times in the face, and then he hung on a cross for several hours. There are still those who say that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He fainted or lost consciousness or something of that nature. And the soldiers just thought he was dead, as did the Jews. Right? But his disciples later revived him. In a short time later, he began to reveal himself to others, giving the appearance of a resurrection. So he says that in the core moment here, believe it or not, all we're trying to do here is show that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. That's it. That's all we're trying to do. Right? It's simple. We just need to demonstrate that this so that later we can show that he really did rise from the dead. Right? He has to be dead to rise from the dead. So the only thing we're seeking to discuss here is his death. Right? That's Paul writes about that in 1 Corinthians 15. Each of these we're going to refer back, I'm sure, to 1 Corinthians 15 somewhere. But Paul says Jesus died, and then he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Right? So it's this theory, this thought is actually kind of experiencing a renaissance. All it was once a common claim made by atheists and agnostics. It actually is resurfacing in unexpected places, and that the big one is Islam, right? And it's making a resurgence in Islam because in the Quran, Surah 4, verses 157 to 158, it says, "He did not die; they did not crucify him." That's what it says about Isa in the Quran. So there's problems with that, right? So Muslims have developed a variety of theories as to what happened. They've gone through look-alike, that people just recorded that it happened. Judas Iscariot was actually nailed to the cross, and then they refer back to the swoon theory, right? And that was the position that a guy named Shabir Ali. He's a Muslim apologist and debater. He took it in a 2009 debate. Did Jesus die? Did Jesus rise from the dead? He actually said no, because, well, he never died. So the simple problem for this is say that the evidence for it is weak is to put the matter far too mildly, right? Islam, including its primary document of faith, did not originate until roughly 600 years after the events of Jesus' life and ministry. So they want to give the Quran 600 years later prominence over the Bible, written less than 100 years later. So, and actually, for the most part, within decades. And if we go into 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 7, we can actually say within the first 18 months. So, which says that Jesus died, according to the scriptures. So, if the claims of most Muslims are true, that God made it appear as though Jesus was crucified, when in fact he was not, then God is a great deceiver. Moreover, there are a number of items that point to the fatal nature of the crucifixion. So first, it must be understood that there is little question among the majority of scholars that Jesus in fact died by Roman crucifixion. Right? So two key facts about Jesus that are very rarely disputed is that Jesus existed and that he died by Roman crucifixion. Right? It says to consider the Roman soldiers, they were killers. They were good at it. They made a job out of it, making art out of it. They were so brutal that the thought of a man surviving is absurd, right? The scourging would have left his back raw and open and bleeding. The blood loss would have been horrendous. And, people didn't survive scourgings normally, let alone the crucifixion, right? The scourging was only the beginning of it, right? Then he had to be crucified. Right? They would put the nails through his hands, through his feet, and hang him on a cross. Right? N.T. Wright says, the old theory that Jesus did not really die on the cross, but revived in the cool of the tomb, has likewise nothing to recommend it. And it is noticeably important that even those historians who are passionately committed to denying the resurrection do not go by this route. Right? They don't say, yeah, Jesus, he didn't really die. Nobody says that because it's just silly. He says Roman soldiers were rather good at killing people, and when given a rebel leader to practice on, they would have had several motives for making sure the job was done properly. Says, I regard this conclusion that Jesus died as coming in the very same sort of category of historical probability, so high as to be visually certain, as the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Right? These guys were very familiar with death. They were good at it. It would be an insult to these Roman executioners to say that they were mistaken about Jesus' fatality. And And then he points to German atheist scholar Gerd Ludemann, who wrote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. I've seen elsewhere where he says that that Jesus' death on the cross is as certain an event as we have in the antiquities. He's an atheist, so we can see that the historians, period, right? They believe Jesus died by crucifixion, right? Says, however, if this were the end of the story, we would not be compelled to accept Christianity, right? Um, so again, with the core moment, he says, we know that Jesus really did die because the scourging alone would have killed him. Roman soldiers were expert killers, and it would likely be impossible to survive a crucifixion, even with modern medicine. Historians universally agree that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. That Jesus died is important to establish, however, so the resurrection case can get off of the ground. Once the case is made that the crucifixion was fatal, it makes the appearances defended in the next chapter much more interesting. How could it be that a man was dead and then seen alive by others in various locations and by multitudes of people? Thus, the F in facts is a vital piece to the case. So, medically speaking, you know, even the account where they put the spear through his ribs and blood and water came out, that's from hypocardia something. I don't remember the full term for it. It's in the paper that I'll put in the link, but or put in the description. But his heart exploded basically, almost like it was melting wax, right? Think of Isaiah when he says, "My heart is like melting wax." And he does say these objections that we're going to go through some objections of it. Um, you know, if you're a beginner, it might be a good idea to just focus on the actual evidence. You can always come back to these objections once you've gained a little more understanding on it. If you think you're ready, keep reading. Just don't get discouraged if it's tough at first. So the first objection says, how do we know that a New Testament author didn't fabricate the crucifixion? Right? He says this objection is somewhat moot or dead, since the majority of scholars will grant that Jesus did, in fact, die by crucifixion. However, something should be said as to why this is taken to be historically true. We have multiple independent attestation for the death of Jesus. So we have several different writers all writing at the same time, and all of them saying the same thing. Jesus died on a cross. Right? The story of the crucifixion appears in all four Gospels and is referred to in a lot of the letters of Paul. If this is recorded by various authors, lends credibility. However, one wishes to lay eyes on evidence from outside the Bible, there's plenty of it, right? The historian of Rome, the great historian of Rome named Cornelius Tacitus, he wrote, this is 2nd century, right? But not all the relief that could come from man, not all the bounties that the prince could bestow, nor all the atonements which could be presented to the gods, availed to relieve Nero from the infamy of being believed to have ordered the conflagration, the fire of Rome. Right? So he's even saying, hey, we all know that Nero did this. Right? Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. Right? So we see here, he's explicitly referring to the death of Jesus. Right? You know, it's crazy because, you know, we're seeing this is early, and this is somebody who obviously does not like Christians, right? Because he talks about their pernicious superstition, right? Um, so, yeah, the testimonies from ancient literature do abound beyond what Tacitus wrote. There's a guy named Mara Bar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata, said, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Right? So we have Lucian of Samosata saying, hey, this guy was crucified. And then we've got Mara Bar Serapion, who said, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. And what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. And so he's even telling us that, hey, just after they had this guy crucified, their kingdom went away. And we know that Jerusalem was destroyed, like utterly and completely destroyed in the year 70. So I think Mar Bar Serapion is a couple hundred years later. So we do have considerable data from Christian sources, right, in the Bible and around the Bible, and non-Christian sources from within and outside the Bible that testify to Jesus' death. So the next one is, aren't Christians just too biased about this? Right? As there are not many serious objections, right? So we kind of talked about the only two objections. As there are not too many to the claim that Jesus' wounds on the cross were fatal, we're going to focus on something more general, like bias, right? And this is the first of the chapters related to the resurrection. Now we're going to talk about the allegation that Christians have difficulty being objective about the resurrection because of personal bias. This issue is one the Christian carries so close to his chest that it is reasonable to assume that he cannot honestly assess facts. We must consider our own motives. Are we merely captives of our own biases? Do we believe in the resurrection because it's part of our faith, or is the resurrection part of our faith because of the evidence? It's kind of what he's getting there. Reasonable thinkers must admit that bias is a live factor. So there's a guy named Mike Licona. He kind of wrote the book on proof for the resurrection. It is, I've got it in my hands right now. It is 640 pages long, and that's just before the bibliography. 641 pages long, and it is nothing but the resurrection of Jesus. That's all he's talking about. So he says, I experienced a return to my default position of belief. Still, although I'm aware that I cannot overcome my personal bias, I maintain that I can be adequately objective, and that my present research is, to the best of my knowledge, an honest investigation of the data. Right? We cannot, no matter how hard we try, right, we can't completely do away with our biases, but we can do work to limit them. The Freudian idea that religious beliefs are the product of wish fulfillment is a charge that may stick to some faiths, but it will not work with Christianity. The idea is that we cannot suffer through this life without some hope that there is more to come. If there were no hope, it'd be bad, right? It'd lead to nihilism, and just general atheism, and it would lead to nihilism that we find in the writings of Nietzsche. He's often credited with gallantly claiming victory for existential atheism, However, it is a misconception, and Nietzsche was, upon arriving at atheism, was horrified by the way it rendered life meaningless. Right? So, regarding the passage wherein the claim of God's death is made, one author points out, the first thing to notice about this passage is not that it is not directed at religious believers, but at atheists. It is the atheists who mock the God who isn't there. And it is the atheists that Nietzsche's prophet considers to be the real fools. They're fools because they have not come to terms with the meaning of the death of God. Think they can rid themselves of God and immortality, but hold on to Christian values and Christian morality. There was a movie about that called Time Changer, and this guy talks about we need to teach Christian morals. Even if we can't teach Christ, we need to teach the morals that he gave. And it kind of shows how this teaching of just the morals of Christ kind of leads to do what you want because there's no like authority behind them. Right? For Nietzsche, this meant that there was no hope for overcoming the reality and imminence of the grave. So while Nietzsche was an atheist, he definitely saw the problem with his atheism. Right? It assumes that just because we would like it to be so, it must not be so. So there are many things throughout our lives that we hope will happen that actually do happen. Right? Girls dream of the wonder of their wedding day, and the day comes. Men dream of becoming wealthy, and some do become wealthy. It makes no sense to say that Christianity is false and there is no afterlife simply because we would like it to be true. It doesn't. That doesn't make sense, right? A guy who goes into Major League Hall of Fame, he wants to be the best baseball player in history. Well, what if he became the best baseball player in history? Does it mean it's not true because he wanted it to be true? That's weird. If our faith merely developed out of a desire to have our wishes fulfilled, then heaven makes perfect sense. One would expect a fabricated afterlife to be rather heavenly. On the other hand, the wish fulfillment hypothesis makes no sense of the Christian teaching regarding the reality of hell. Right? So yes, if we wanted to imagine a heaven, it would be the heaven of the Bible. However, we don't want to imagine there being a need for hell. That wouldn't be something we would imagine there being a need for if we were just doing this of our own accord. Right? So how would we be comforted by the possibility that one day we would pass through a doorway into a world of suffering that is everlasting? For this reason, our desires cannot be credited with creation of the afterlife. Moreover, it would also fail to explain the moral guidelines that we are meant to live by as Christians in this world. If we're doing nothing but wish fulfillment, why wouldn't we create a faith that allowed us to indulge in every pleasure of present earthly existence and then have that promise of heaven on top of it? Right? Wouldn't we make it the easiest way to get to heaven? Right? Do what you want and you still go to heaven. That's what we'd make it if we were doing wish fulfillment. Right? But once again, this doesn't explain the crucifixion. So we see the need to understand that well, yes, I want this to be true. I also hold that yes, this is indeed true. Right? The Gospels are true. Jesus died on the cross for the sins of the world. Right? Says I would not want to be in the same boat with Nietzsche, but if he was right and atheism was true, I would be forced to join him in God's funeral dirge. Thankfully, he's wrong. Right? Thankfully, we can say pretty clearly that Nietzsche was wrong, that there is a need, or that we do know that God is real and God raised Jesus from the dead. Right? So the F stands for fatal because Jesus' wounds in the crucifixion were fatal. Right? The first point that needs to be explained to students is that Jesus did in fact die on the cross. He died on the cross. There are going to be people who say, well, yeah, this isn't really that big of a deal. We should understand that Jesus died on a cross and we should be okay with this, right? There are only 3 evidences to which students need to point in order to make a beginner appeal to the death of Christ, right? Point out the vast majority of scholars that accept Jesus' death by Roman crucifixion. By vast majority, it's probably 99%. Might be a little lower, like 95, but the vast majority, you know, students, we need to understand how absurd the idea is that a Roman soldier would ever be mistaken about the death of somebody, right? It wasn't just the person on the cross's life on the line. If they survived a crucifixion, that Roman guard and probably the Roman guard's family would all take their place on the cross. And then we need to point out that there are at least 4 documents describing the death of Jesus in the Bible and 3 more outside of the Bible. And, you know, these are pieces of evidence. Even if somebody says it's not good evidence, it is still pieces of evidence. Right? We've got 7 pieces. And they want to throw away the 4 from the Bible. We've still got 3 major sources from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Right? Any claim that Jesus did not die by crucifixion is based on speculation, and there's no evidence for it. Right? There's no 1st or 2nd century evidence that says that Jesus did not die on the cross. So we've talked about the fact that the crucifixion was fatal. This means that the F, in fact, should be understandable for learners, right? The information facilitators should be able to train a class of believers or seekers in the truth of F, right? And that there are atheist scholars who will even agree with us and say, yes, Jesus died on the cross. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of them. Moreover, we have multiple independent attestation to the event in the Gospels and the writings of Paul. Jesus' wounds on the cross were fatal. Right? And once we understand that the cross was fatal, we're ready to move on to the A, which stands for appearances. And we're really going to get into next week these appearances of Jesus to people after he died, after his death on the cross. So, you know, it's kind of a big deal that they have appearances. And that if nothing else, we know that Jesus at least, or that the disciples at least believed that they saw Jesus. All right, so you guys got any questions on any of this?
Pastor Matt.
Yes, ma'am.
So these atheists, because we know that we know Jesus, because they were eyewitness that he crucified, he was beaten on the cross, he died, he was buried, and it was eyewitness that they went to the cross and went to the tomb and he wasn't there. So listening to what you're saying, I'm wondering if they were thinking in their mind that Jesus may what they call it, when somebody hide themselves to make somebody feel that they died, what they call it, pretend to be dead and hide himself. I was wondering if that they were thinking that.
Yeah,
the haters are thinking that.
Some do, and that's kind of the basis for the swoon theory. Is they're like, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. You know, there are those who believe that like a twin took his place, or a lookalike took his place, or that they put Judas on the cross, or that he didn't really die, he just passed out. But you know, the medical evidence for the death of Jesus on the cross is pretty overwhelming. especially when you look at the description of something that they would have had
Right.
no clue what was going on in the first century when they're talking about blood and water coming out when the spear was thrust in his side. They would have had no clue that that would have been a thing, but it would have. And I can't remember what it's called. It's pericardial something. Basically, there's a sac around your heart, and when you go through
Yeah.
so much stress, it fills with a liquid, like a clear fluid, and the spear going through to pierce his heart, it also pierced that sac. Thus, the clear liquid and the blood came out, and that's why you have the blood and water being talked about by the doctor, nonetheless.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Pastor Man.
Yeah, not a problem. Anything else? No? All right. Well, let me stop the recording.